I start with a simple drawing of the key shapes. I also mark in where the major shadow and light areas will be in the final painting. I make sure to minimize the detail in the distance because that will help to add the feeling of space. I put in some rocks, thinking more about an interesting composition rather than where the rocks are in the actual reference. The same with the rest of my drawing. I never let reality get in the way of a good painting, so if I think a tree needs to be moved or rocks need to be moved to create a better composition, then I go right ahead and do so. I now thoroughly wet the back of my paper. This will give me a lot more time to paint when I get to that stage. Here I'm putting lots of water in my palette for the bright green, and I'm doing the same for the darker green colour. For my bright green, I start with aureolin. This is a cool yellow. Any other cool yellow would work for this, something like a lemon yellow. And then I add some cobalt turquoise. And this will give me a very vibrant green. I first aim to get the colour right, then I adjust the consistency of the paint to get the right tone I'm after. In this case, I need to add a lot more paint. It's important to test the colours of your mixture on a scrap piece of watercolour paper before you start painting. In this way, you can paint very fast without having to worry about whether or not you have the right colour and the right tone. For my duller green, I'm starting with raw umber, which is a dull yellowish brown. And I'll add cobalt turquoise to that. Here I'm adding a little bit of burnt sienna. This will both warm the green and dull it at the same time. But the bulk of the mixture is just raw umber and cobalt turquoise. Again, I test this on a scrap piece of watercolor paper. Now that I have my starting colours mixed, I re-wet the back of my paper and also wet my backing board. I start by picking up some of my bright green, taking half the paint out of my brush and then dipping the point in water. This will dilute it so that I can use this mixture for the distant green, because objects that are in the distance will look lighter than similar objects that are in the foreground. I've painted around the dark tree trunks. This way, when I paint the trunks later, none of the green will show through. As I move towards the foreground, I strengthen my mixture. I left some little sections of white untouched paper in the foreground. This helps to add some additional detail in that section. Here I'm lifting some of the paint in areas where I'll have some highlights later in this painting. I picked up my fan brush and I'm using it to create grasses along the edge of my shoreline. Later, when I paint the water, I'll use the same technique, except I'll be dragging the watercolor, or the color of the water, down into the grasses. That way I can preserve the shape of the grass. I'm now mixing a darker color using the two greens I already have, and then adding some French ultramarine to the mix, as well as some burnt sienna. This thicker mix will be used to create splatter texture in the foreground. Splatter is a technique that helps create additional depth to the painting because it brings more detail in the foreground, which contrasts with the very little detail in the background. I vary the color and consistency of this paint. For this next section, I turn the painting upside down so I can paint the darker tree foliage without it flowing into the brighter green below. I'm lightening some of this darker mix because it's too dark for this section of the painting. I use the side of my brush to create a broken edge texture. I make sure not to have too much paint in my brush when I do this. At this stage, I'm only placing the lightest tones of the distant dark green foliage. I vary the mix as I go along, adding burnt sienna if I want to warm up some of the green colour. I continue to lift out highlights as needed. I let this stage dry before going on to the next step. I thicken my lighter tone mix for the next stage of the foliage. I do the same for this darker tone by adding more French ultramarine and burnt sienna and a small amount of the other colours as needed. I like to use my hog hair fan brush to create the texture of the foliage. By changing how I hold the brush and present it to the paper, I can create quite a variety of textures. For the branches, I mix a reasonably thick mix of burnt sienna and cobalt blue. I use a smaller brush for this finer detail. Obviously, for the big trunks of the trees later, I'll use a bigger brush. I use more paint without any more water to thicken the mix for the darker parts of the branches. I use the tip of the brush for the finer branches and the body of the brush for the thicker ones. Now added some French ultramarine and some more aureolin to my bright green colour, and I'm going to use that to create the shapes around the bright green foliage. I also paint through some of the wet branches. Having established the highlight areas, I now extend the darker areas further into the painting. I use a very light touch with my brush so I don't lift the paint underneath, and I keep varying the angle of it to create different edge textures. As I paint, I keep looking at the reference to see where there are darker areas and lighter areas, and I make adjustments accordingly. This area here is in strong shadow. I need to clear some paint out of my palette so that I can mix the dark colours for the tree trunks. I'm mixing not quite a black colour, I'm leaning it a small amount towards the brown. I can't paint the distant branches at this point because that area is still wet, and if I try to paint into it, all I'd get is soft edges. Here there's a hard edge that goes into a soft edge, so I can paint that. There also appears to be two trees here, however I'm going to merge them into a single tree. I use little flicks downwards which create the grasses at the base of the tree. I soften some of the connection points where the trunk merges with the foliage around it. In the corner of my palette, I create a thicker mix of this paint, and I can use that to darken some area of the tree trunk and give it a bit more form. And this tree has some more brown in it, so I'm going to add more burnt sienna to my mix. Light, quick flicks of the brush can create some nice broken edge textures. Sometimes I tap my brush on a towel just to make sure I don't have too much paint in it. Again, I use some light and quick brush strokes to create the texture of the bark. Here I'm going to paint around the bright foliage, and that will push that foliage into the foreground. As soon as I put that mark down, I saw it was bleeding out a little bit, so that says this area is still probably a little bit too wet. I might be able to come in from the top. Right now I'm just concentrating on the big shapes. Later I'll go in and put in some of the smaller, finer branches with a rigger. But I think now I can put this in. Now, that edge is a bit too sharp, so I'll get my fan brush and just a weak mixture of this background color I've been using. Take out a lot of moisture. And here and there, break up some of that sharp edge with some additional foliage. I can also soften some of the edges with some clean water. I'm going to lift just a few areas here for some highlights. You could use a tissue, but I find the brush just gives you a slightly softer edge. Now I'm going to mix a shadow colour. I'll start with French ultramarine and then just a small amount of permanent rose. And a tiny bit of burnt sienna just to dull it off a bit. I start with the distant shadows without a lot of paint in my brush. I'm using the side of my brush and the texture of the paper to create the impression of distant foliage in shadow. Here I'm using my fan brush to paint the shadows between the grasses, which highlights the positive grass shape. I thicken this green with some aureolin and French ultramarine, and I use that to modify the shadow colours by just dabbing some of the thicker paint into the areas of shadow. This makes the shadows look more interesting rather than a flat shape. I continue to paint the shadows in and around the grasses. Some of the shadows are greener than others, so I vary the colour as needed. It's better to leave more highlight than you think you need. It's always easy to remove a highlight, but it's much harder to retrieve it if you lose it. Remember to vary the angle of the brush because the grasses are going in many different angles. And then there's a little bush here, so I'm just going to drop in some of this darker shadow colour, maybe a little bit more burnt sienna. I'm always adjusting my shapes and tones to make sure I don't create any boring repetition. Now I pick up a finer brush to create some thin branches and also dab in a few leaves. I can also use the fan brush for some of these leaves. So here we've got a very dark colour against a light, and it draws the eye to it. Just a few dabs to create a texture here. The grasses in the distance will appear much shorter than the ones in the foreground. And there's a rock that's going to go here. I'm not worrying too much about the water's edge. I'll do some work on that later when we do the reflection. The main thing is not to lose all this light. I'd like a bit more variety here, so I'm just going to get my fan brush, just drop in a bit of water, and that will just lighten the section. Same here. And we'll just let that do its thing. And all of a sudden we're creating some light. Maybe even here, this is a bit too flat. Good. Okay, so now let's have a look at this side. Again, shapes in the distance, you've got to keep them lighter in tone. And technically the colours should be a bit duller too, but there's so much light here, I'm not worrying about that. I'm really working more on keeping the tones right. I like this area here being light because the water is heading in that direction. Something like that. An interesting little plant there. I'm thinking maybe if I can keep some of that when I do the water, that would be very handy. So I'll just put that in now. And I'll go back into putting in the shadow colours. So I've got my big puddle of shadow colour here, and I'm modifying it with the greens because there's so much green in the painting. There's another trunk there I've got to put in. You don't have to use a fan brush to do this. You could use like a size 8 brush. Sometimes you can just get the brush like this, and then you just splay the hairs out. So they just look more like that, right? I just find the fan brush a lot more convenient. Here I'm just mixing a dark brown for some tree trunks, primarily French ultramarine and burnt sienna. That's good enough. I just want to hint that this tree goes off in that direction. And now we work on the shadow in this area. Again, I keep varying its tone by adding water or adding more paint. And make these grasses a little bit longer because they're closer to you. A bit more scratchy looking down here. My shadow colour has been modified greatly from all the green that's been mixed into it, but that doesn't matter because one, I'm painting onto a green area, and two, shadows are always affected by the colour of the object underneath the shadow. I'll just go in and drop in some of these darker shadows within the shadow shapes. And then this area here needs to be much darker. I mix this dark green primarily with French ultramarine, some of the bright green I already had, and a little bit more yellow. Vary the angle of these grasses. I'm always stepping back to gauge tones and shapes and how they connect to one another. And I've got very little water in my brush because I'm painting into damp paper. If it's too much water in my brush, all I'll end up doing is creating cauliflowers. Not careful. It's too dry, so it'll give me hard edges, so I'm going to stay away from that. Scrape out a few more highlights in these grasses just while I've got a chance. Again, don't want to overdo it. This concludes part 1 of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give it a like, and if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please do so. It helps me out a lot. And if you're able, please consider supporting me on Patreon. I look forward to seeing you for part 2.